You know, when we talk about the messaging battle, when we talk about where the blame lay, you know, the internet obviously is a tool now that people can use more and more in the West, also here. But, you know, you're familiar with the perception in the Arab world and the Muslim world that so much is to blame on the colonial powers. You know, you referenced Palestine and the plight of the Palestinians, something that is often articulated by politicians, by leaders in the Arab and Muslim world to be at the hearts and minds of all Muslims all over the world. I mean, how much is the West to blame? We hear Western politicians being blamed. We hear, and again, perhaps this is about half-truths, because it's certainly true that, you know, when the invasion of Iraq occurred, obviously the West, the US, Britain, and others very, very involved, that had exacerbated sectarian tensions, which one could argue then helped, you know, in terms of the rise of radical Islam and what have you. I mean, so is the West to blame?
Well, no, that's half the truth.
Right.
See. So just
partially to blame?
Partially. So just like there's Islamophobia because some Muslims are extremists, there is also among Muslim majority nations, as you'd be aware, Ahmed, Westophobia.
Right.
Yeah. The same thing happens in the reverse. That one mistake is made by George Bush, and democracy as an entire value system is blamed. And that's the problem here. One mistake is made by bin Laden and Al-Qaeda, and Islam as an entire value system is blamed. People take these mistakes and then generalize and stereotype. And I think what we need to start doing is, again, as the Islamists have been doing for decades, working on the grassroots within Muslim majority societies to complete this picture, to correctly challenge mistakes where they do occur. I've always been opposed to the Iraq War, but the fact is that the US and the West didn't go into Iraq because Iraqis were Muslim. That's not the reason they went in.
Right.
That wasn't a war against Islam.
Right.
Likewise, they went in to save Muslims in Kosovo.
Yeah.
And in Libya, there was an intervention.
I think there was, the rhetoric became irresponsible after the invasion, where it did become us versus them. And, you know, in that construct, who could the them be if not Arabs or Muslims? I think, at least from a perception issue. But I do see what you're saying about...
I mean, George Bush didn't help there, did he?
He wasn't articulate.
Well, he used the word crusade, and that's, you know, that's exactly the sort of word bin Laden would use.
Right. Right, and he said a clash of civilizations, or at least someone in the administration had mentioned that, which is certainly not helpful. I do want to just show this very short clip and get your reaction to this before we continue. Let's take a look at this clip. It's the Coca-Cola Pepsi clip.
Yeah. We don't have a Coca-Cola to their Pepsi.
So, you're referring to who, and explain to us whether or not you think Al-Qaeda is selling perhaps a better version of that product, to use the metaphor.
So metaphors, brands. Currently, if a young and angry Muslim in the Middle East wants to reject the status quo, wants to rebel, right, there's two ways they can go. They can either become a democratic activist, as happened in the Arab uprisings before they were usurped, or they become an Islamist. Now, in the 60s, it was communism. People like Che Guevara, who are these trendy young medics, you know, were traveling across the world. It also happened to be a young medic that recruited me to Hizb ut-Tahrir.
Interesting.
You know, it's not strange for radical movements to come from the hard sciences like that. The zeitgeist of today for young Arabs could either be Islamism or it could be young Democrats. Now, sadly, as I said, we don't have a Coca-Cola to their Pepsi.
Right.
Is that the brand at the moment on the grassroots that's proving to be the most attractive is Islamism. We currently have up to 200 young British born and raised Muslims who've traveled to Syria to fight. So like Che Guevara traveled, these guys are traveling for Islamism. They're not traveling for democratic activism. Across Europe, we have up to 800 who've traveled to Syria. So what I'm saying we need to start doing is working on the grassroots to critique the Islamist narrative, to distinguish it from Islam, the faith, to unpick it, to challenge their leaders, to challenge their symbols and their narratives, and present alternatives. It should be relatively easy to make democratic activism attractive to young people. It was in the Arab uprisings. But then the second stage needs to happen, as I argued on my TED Talk, that those young Democrats then need to be organized in a form of a social movement. Let's look at Egypt as a case study. Part of the problem with Egypt, now I'm going to use the word liberal here, but we use it in England in a different sense to mean a respect for individual liberty, not the left-right polarization, which is partly what we had to interrupt this program for.
Unfortunately, yes, that is the case.
But in Egypt, the problem was that the Democrats weren't liberal, and the liberals weren't democratic. And that's why matters came to a head in the way they did with the coup. What I mean by that is the Democrats, the people that had the democratic mandate, the Muslim Brotherhood, who were Islamists in their ideological convictions, but were elected and therefore were attempting to defend the democratic system as it had then existed. They weren't necessarily liberal in their sense of respecting women's rights, human rights, and all the other issues. For example, they wouldn't let 20% of the population, Coptic Christians, become head of state.
Of course.
On the other hand, we had people that claimed they were secular, claimed they were liberal Democrats, but didn't necessarily believe in the democratic process and backed a coup. And so what we really need, ideally, is a third phenomenon to emerge on the grassroots on Egypt and to organize itself. That phenomenon already exists in the form of the young Arabs that sparked Egypt's uprising,
Certainly.
but they're not organized. And that phenomenon is liberal Democrats.